A proponent of the Big Bang Theory, at least if he is an atheist, must believe that the universe came from nothing and by nothing. But surely that doesn't make sense. For such a conclusion is, in the words of the philosopher of science, Bernhard Königsscheider, in head-on collision with the most successful ontological commitment in the history of science, namely the metaphysical principle that out of nothing, nothing comes.
Sit down and shut the fuck up.
For the fifth argument in the series of arguments against theism, I use an argument developed by Felipe León. This argument can be found in the book, Is God the Best Explanation of Things? There is additionally at least one, although there may be more, articles published by Felipe León on this argument. I'll call this argument the PMC argument against God. PMC stands for Principle of Material Causality. Classical theism holds God exists necessarily, and he created the world. And specifically, number 1, God is wholly distinct from the world. Number 2, God is the originating or sustaining cause of the world. Number 3, God created the world ex nihilo. That means out of nothing. This argument seeks to establish that creatio ex nihilo is impossible, and thus so is classical theism. First, we'll present the argument formally, then we'll clarify some terminology and make some caveats, and then we'll get into its defense and potential objections to the argument. So here, formally, is the argument. Premise 1. All concrete objects that have an originating or sustaining efficient cause have an originating or sustaining material cause. Premise 2. Classical theism holds the universe is a concrete object that has an originating or sustaining efficient cause without either an originating nor sustaining material cause. Conclusion. Classical theism is false. Now let's get into some clarification and terminology. First of all, the first premise, where a PSR is employed, a principle of explanation, on behalf of the origination of materials, we're going to call this PSR a PMC, principle of material causality for short. Now we're going to clarify what concrete, originating cause, sustaining cause, material cause, what are these things? Well, a concrete thing here is defined as an entity in the ontological category of substance. This excludes things in other categories like properties, relations, events, tropes, etc. Here are some examples of substances: atoms, stars, rocks, planets, trees, animals, people, and so forth. This is also to be distinguished from concrete entities in other ontological categories, like shapes, surfaces, events, and so on. This is also to be distinguished from abstract objects, propositions, numbers, sets, etc. An originating cause is the cause of the temporal beginning of a thing's existence, if it has such a thing. A sustaining cause is the cause of a thing's continued existence, and a material cause is the temporally or ontologically prior things or stuff from which, although not necessarily of which, a thing is made. Here are two caveats about the PMC principle, the principle of material causality. First caveat is that PMC applies only to concrete objects as we've defined them, and thus PMC makes no claim about entities in other ontological categories. Second caveat is that needing a material cause only follows from being a concrete object with an originating or sustaining efficient cause. So PMC doesn't rule out the beginning of an object's existence ex nihilo if it lacks a originating or sustaining efficient cause. So with everything clarified, let's move on to support the actual premises in the argument. The first premise was just the assertion of what we're calling PMC, namely that all concrete objects that have an originating or sustaining efficient cause have an originating or sustaining material cause. So what are the supports for PMC? There are 4 supports offered for the principle of material causality. The first is that our empirical support only confirms and never contradicts PMC. The second support is that the law of conservation of mass/energy further corroborates PMC. The law states that a given quantity of energy at a given time must be caused by the same quantity of energy at an earlier time. Now, PMC offers a simple explanation with wide explanatory scope for this phenomena. The third support for the PMC principle is that a strong version of it entails a weak version of it, and a strong version of the PMC principle seems intuitively true, which is thus prima facie evidence for it and thus for weak PMC. A strong version of the PMC principle states that necessarily all concrete objects with an originating or sustaining efficient cause have an originating or sustaining material cause. Here's an intuition pump. It would seem that the possibility of the origination of an object requires the prior potential for it to exist. Now, this potential for the object's existence must reside in some actual things or stuff. Nothingness, non-existence, has no potentiality. Prima facie, then, concrete objects can't come to exist ex nihilo. A fourth support for PMC comes from considering a weak version of it, namely that possibly every concrete object with an originating or sustaining efficient cause has an originating or sustaining material cause. The grounds for the truth of believing the general PMC apply a fortiori to a weak PMC. A fortiori just means even more so.
But weak PMC implies the falsity of classical theism, because in one possible world W, where weak PMC holds, creatio ex nihilo in that world did not occur, and thus neither does the God of classical theism. But the God of classical theism is necessary, and thus, if it doesn't exist in any possible world, it doesn't exist in all possible worlds, including the actual world. This weak PMC argument is meant for those unconvinced by the metaphysical necessity of PMC. So those are the four motivations for PMC. But now let's look at potential rebuttals. There are two kinds of responses one could give. The first kind of response is one can provide a defeater for premise 1. The second kind of response one could level is they could accept the argument, rejecting classical theism, and promote an alternative theism-friendly option. We will look at both kinds of responses, starting with defeaters for premise 1. The first attempted response to premise 1 is to say that God is omnipotent. Thus, premise 1 is defeated. However, appealing to God's omnipotence is question-begging. Omnipotence is the ability to do all that is possible. The question at issue is whether or not ex nihilo creation is possible. Someone could respond, it's conceivable that God can create ex nihilo, which is evidence that he can. However, if this is so, then it's equally conceivable that a universe can pop into existence ex nihilo without cause, which disproves classical theism. A second line of attack one can use on the first premise is as follows. One might say either 1. Any proposition that can be denied without contradiction is not necessary, and or 2. Conceiving of X without contradiction means X is epistemically possible. Thus, denying strong PMC or conceiving of creatio ex nihilo does not entail contradiction. Therefore, we should reject or withhold belief in strong PMC. But here are two replies to this point. The first is that, at best, this would just take out the conceivability support for strong PMC. But this consideration doesn't touch the inductive support or the weak PMC. Recall that we gave 4 supports for PMC. This consideration only deals with the third support pertaining to the strong PMC. Second, if we reject PMC for this reason, that would entail rejecting the ex nihilo nihil fit principle, but if we reject that principle, that would entail classical theism is false, because then there's a possible world that exists uncaused. This follows because if the ex nihilo nihil fit principle is false, which is the principle that from nothing, nothing comes, if that's false, then in a possible world, something comes from nothing. Or to be more precise, something begins to exist without cause. But if that's true in a possible world, then in that possible world, the necessarily existent God of classical theism doesn't exist, but if a necessary being doesn't exist in one possible world, it follows it doesn't exist in any possible world, including the actual world. Basically, there's a horn, and on both options, classical theism is gored. The first option is the bar set for the acceptance of a metaphysical principle is low, in which case PMC is accepted, in which case classical theism is false, or the bar for the acceptance of a metaphysical principle is raised, in which case PMC is rejected, along with ex nihilo nihil fit, in which case classical theism is again false. In this context, why is rejecting PMC equivalent to rejecting the ex nihilo nihil fit principle? Well, if we reject PMC because denying it or conceiving of a counterexample to it is not contradictory, we should reject the nihil fit principle because denying it and conceiving of a counterexample to it is not contradictory either. Here's a third attempted line of attack on the first premise. Quantum mechanics falsifies the first premise. The pattern of reply is similar here. PMC is not violated, and thus classical theism is false, and if it were violated, classical theism still comes up false. PMC is not violated because it allows for no originating or sustaining material cause if there is no originating or sustaining efficient cause. And even if we granted that this somehow poses a problem for PMC, it equally well poses a problem for classical theism because now we have objects beginning to exist without cause. The last two objections to the first premise I'm going to go through quickly because they're easy to understand, or we've already gone through the exact same pattern of objection. So the first objection is libertarian free agents exist, and they cause things from outside the causal order. This falsifies premise 1, but obviously it doesn't. Granting the above doesn't admit of creatio ex nihilo, but rather energy transfer from the non-physical to the physical. Second objection. PMC intuition and empirical support were formed in the universe, but the origination of the universe is categorically different. However, if this is true, we then undercut the same support for the need of efficient causes, which defeats classical theism as it implies a possible world God didn't create. Okay, so those were all the attempted objections to the first premise. However, what happens when someone grants the argument but proposes a theism-friendly alternative? Alternatives arise from rejecting one of the three tenets of classical theism's creation account previously stated. Those being 1, that God is wholly distinct from the world, 2, that God is the originating or sustaining cause of the world, 3, that God created ex nihilo. So rejecting one of these is to reject classical theism. So let's go through different views that do this, starting with rejection of 1, that God is wholly distinct from the world. Rejecting this would mean that either A, the world is identical to God, B, the world is made from stuff of God, C, the world is a mode of God, D, the world is an idea in the mind of God. A through C are problematic as they reject classical theism and embrace pantheism, panentheism, or Spinozic monism. D is too close to Berkeley's idealism, which sucks. Little have been persuaded of it. Rejecting 2, that God does not create the universe in any sense, call this hands-off theism, well, it seems antecedently unlikely that many will ascribe to such a view, as it denies many standard motivations for theism, like fine-tuning, design, first cause, contingency. Also, such a God seems far less worthy of worship. It didn't create us, it just happens to exist amongst many other things that also happen to exist. Rejecting 3 means that God creates the universe out of pre-existent materials. This view is again inconsistent with standard cosmological arguments, besides for design, but it also seems to entail a less religiously significant God, as he's not the first cause or the sufficient explanation for its existence. That concludes the video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, and if you want to see a miserable fail on the behalf of Alex O'Connor to assess this argument, click the link here.